good evening. Welcome to Community and Technology, where we connect the global community with news, information, and resources that we hope will help improve your life. I'm Stu Reid. I'm here with my co-host, Dave Burstein. Hey, Dave.
Hello. And the guy we have on is going to be really interesting.
Okay, well, the guest, very special guest, is Sascha Segan. He's a PC Magazine's lead mobile analyst, having reviewed more than 1,100 smartphones, tablets, and other gadgets in more than 15 years with PC Magazine. He's the head of PC Mag's fastest mobile network projects in the US and Canada, and he runs a Race to 5G tracker and writes opinions on tech and society. Segan is a multiple award winner travel writer. Other than his hometown of New York, his favorite cities are Barcelona and Hong Kong. He's a fourth generation Manhattanite and now lives in Queens with his wife and daughter. Sascha, welcome to Community and Technology.
Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. I'm going to throw this over to Dave. Dave.
I invited Sascha because he's the best reporter on what's actually happening on US networks right now. PC Magazine allows him to do a lot of testing. He talks to everybody else who tests. And there's a whole lot of things he's come up with. Sascha, how fast did you find out T-Mobile was in Midtown Manhattan in 4G a while back?
Well,
I wrote you up on that one.
I mean, our most recent tests are...
No, not recent. I'm talking about years ago.
Years ago? You're going to have to remind me of my own reporting.
Well, you went out there and discovered that a 4G cell site in production at T-Mobile was delivering over 500 megabits a second download because they were using LAA.
Yeah, and that was the whole LAA period when we were finding that in New York. We went to Chicago and saw LAA on AT&T. And by now we've seen it on all three major networks.
Now, just to make a point, how fast is the average connection on T-Mobile's 5G, which is the best in the United States, in my opinion?
Well, we're on the road checking that out right now. But the average is, if you look at some of the other testing around, like OpenSignal and Ookla speed test, you're generally seeing averages in the 100 to 200 megabit range.
And Neville Ray says it's 300 megabits. And I suspect he's being more accurate than those tests, which are valuable but have some limits.
Well, what Neville is probably also calling out is that he's only looking at 5G tests done in decent 5G contexts, whereas a lot of those other testers are mixing in a lot of stuff that may trip the 5G icon on your phone, but would actually just be 4G. Dave, did we lose you? Looks to me like connectivity problems have hit.
Am I back now?
You're back now. I can hear you.
Apologies. What I was asking before I got so rudely disconnected by my cable modem or somewhere in my system, more like the Zoom than the cable modem. The cable modem's pretty solid. Could you explain to people the different kinds of things they call 5G? And then I'll ask you, is it really right to call it 5G if it's slower than 4G?
So legitimately, 5G just means that some part of your connection, some tiny part of your connection, is using an encoding called 5G NR. And that is a particular way of encoding data to go through the air that is a bit more efficient than 4G and a bit more flexible than 4G and has somewhat different rules than 4G. So if any of your connection is 5G NR, then technically it's 5G. And now what you're not hearing from me is any kind of standard involving performance, any kind of standard involving applications, any kind of standard involving experience. Because technically, 5G does not differentiate or offer any of that. Now, 5G definitely has the option, when well implemented on wide channels with a good network, to create experiences that are far better than 4G. But it doesn't have to. Ultimately, for something to be 5G, it just needs to be using this new protocol. But it could be a slow thing using the new protocol. It could be a weak thing using the new protocol. And that confuses a lot of people because they hear a new G and they're thinking experiences and applications. But the network providers and the whole network equipment chain, they're just saying, well, it uses the new protocol. It's 5G. So there's a real disconnect there.
It's worse than a real disconnect. It's deliberately something I can't say on the air. The industry decided to take 4G, if it happens to have this little bit of software that actually doesn't make it better in practical networks, and say it's 5G, because everybody thought 5G was great. Instead of building real 5G networks, they found a way to throw some software on called DSS that fools your phone, but there is no official definition of 5G.
There is an official definition of 5G, and the official definition of 5G is something that uses the 5G NR radio interface.
No, that's the definition coming from the 3GPP Standards Organization, which has submitted that to the ITU to be the 5G IMT 2020 specification. But just because 3GPP says this is what 5G is, doesn't make it official. It does, but we're talking semantics. It doesn't matter. The key point is that all the 5G you're getting on AT&T, the vast majority of the 5G you're getting on Verizon, and some of the 5G you're getting on T-Mobile performs at 4G speeds.
Absolutely.
Or even a little bit worse.
Absolutely.
And Sascha's been documenting that for years, and even a few years ago documented the T-Mobile 4G live test in Manhattan was over 500 megabits.
And AT&T in Chicago, similarly with LAA.
I missed that.
Same kind of performance, yeah.
And I got a lot of things I want to throw at Sascha, but if we get time later on, I just got the story that a University of Chicago professor tested the 5G with LAA, or 4G with LAA, I forget which, I'll see in a moment, and discovered it was seriously interfering with the Wi-Fi. A story I wrote up, I think, back in 2016, that was what was going to happen. But let me throw at Sascha some stuff that I prepared ahead of time, because he's done interesting stuff and I want to get him there. You just tested T-Mobile's home service. It costs $60. It uses wireless. How well did it work?
It worked pretty well. I mean, I'm in a very good T-Mobile signal spot. I have mid-band 5G signal, which I think is the real key to having good performance on T-Mobile. And I got pretty consistently speeds of averaging maybe 150 megabits down and, you know, a good 50, 60 megabits up, which is terrific. It definitely fluctuated in a way that wired internet does not fluctuate. And the modem that they're selling is extremely buggy. But once I got a working unit of the modem, my speeds did not generally go below about 20 megabits down, and occasionally would be as high as 400 megabits down. So it's a much more heavily fluctuating system than wired. It's, of course, very dependent on your T-Mobile connection and whether the T-Mobile tower near you has available capacity. But for people who have that connection near them. It definitely beats DSL, and I would consider it competitive with cable. Not fiber, though. Fiber is the gold standard.
And in fact, it is, 20 times faster than anything Verizon can sell me. Because I'm one of the about 30% of New Yorkers they never ran fiber to. An ugly story, considering that they promised in 2008 to fiber the whole city in order to get their cable, their video franchise. Now, looking ahead, is $60 the right price for that service from T-Mobile?
I think that, I mean, $60 is the oligopoly price for broadband in most of the cities of America at the moment.
Did you say oligopoly price?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes.
$60 is the rough price that most cable and fiber providers have settled on in a market where there is almost no price competition whatsoever. And T-Mobile is just sitting themselves right in the middle there.
In fact, a similar service in France would cost 30 euros, which at the current exchange rate, I think is $37. And we had Scott Walston on the show a little while ago. Scott was the chief economist of the U.S. broadband plan. He's the best economist working in telecom in the U.S. right now, I think. Certainly the best in Washington. And we talked about if the U.S. efficiently bought their wireless connection for people, and there was competition, strong competition, what would the price be? And that's exactly what should be happening for Lifeline, the emergency broadband subsidy, and the infrastructure plan. The government should find a way to get it close to what a competitive market price would be. Scott's estimate was $10 to $20. Mine was $15 to $25.
Well, and for you to have a competitive market price, you have to have a competitive market, which to me means local loop unbundling.
Well, I don't want to explain local loop unbundling because it's not interesting, because it's not going to happen in the United States. But that's one of the reasons why French
we had it from 1996 to 2003.
Yeah.
We actually still.
A lot of folks went out of business.
It's Sonic.
A lot of CLECs were born and died.
Yeah, we had a whole slew of companies I remember well. COVID, Rhythms, North Point, and a lot of others who took advantage of that. They all went bust. And why that didn't work in the US when it worked in France and to a lesser extent in Germany and in England, something that would bore people by explaining.
They even have it in Canada.
Yeah, but it's very limited. It doesn't work very well in Canada. It did not go down, and they just virtually killed it. Tech savvy.
Dave, let me just give a quick high-level explanation for our audience. Unbundling basically means that the dominant monopoly guy, whether it be AT&T and Verizon, lets competitors come in and use the local part of the service that actually connects to the household. And for a while, telecommunications got deregulated here in the U.S., and they opened that up and made it possible. But somehow, the big guys who did open up their networks figured out a way to eventually squeeze those guys out of business.
And when you talk about these countries that have much lower home broadband prices, universally, these countries have some form of local loop unbundling and some form of competition happening on incumbent hardwired lines. There is not the US dream of all competition has to be massive overbuilding is completely unique to the United States. The idea that for anyone to come in as a competitor, they have to build their entire duplicative physical network.
You mean we should tear up all the streets 4 times? Is that realistic?
Well, the reason that there's this new dream of 5G wireless competitors is because they don't have to tear up the streets. But the philosophy that, well, we're only going to have competitors by massively overbuilding, that's the same. It's just that now we don't have to tear up the streets. But if you look at other countries that have reasonably priced wireless, I mean, reasonably priced home broadband, not talking about wireless, reasonably priced home broadband, it is almost always because they have local loop unbundling, not because they are doing some sort of crazy competitive overbuilding.
Yeah. And there's lots I can say on that, but let me keep going on some of the things that matter to people right now. What is the performance that people are getting on the good 5G, which is using the mid-band, and what do you expect that performance to be as Verizon and AT&T over the next 3 years match T-Mobile? T-Mobile is at about half the country right now. 150 million pops is the last thing announced, with mid-band, which really is a big improvement.
Yeah, absolutely. And we have cars on the road right now going to 30 different cities and a bunch of rural areas around them, testing this at the moment. And those test results are going to come out at the end of August. So at the end of August, I will know what the real answer is, and that'll come out on PCMag.com as our annual fastest mobile networks piece. Now, in our limited testing so far, T-Mobile's mid-band 5G, I have definitely seen performance in the 300s and 400s megabit range in good signal contexts in the area immediately around me. I think that as we look at a broader perspective across the country, we're going to see lower numbers overall. But when you're talking about mid-band 5G, I think that 300 to 500 megabit zone is definitely something that carriers can target and is something that we could come to expect from that kind of technology.
Yeah, I've been writing that as 100 to 400 because that's more common. In Europe, we're seeing numbers that are typically 100 something.
Mm-hmm.
Korea has some numbers that say 600 and 700, but I suspect they're doing some things that goose it. There is no number anywhere from the speeds in China, which has twice as much 5G mid-band, the decent stuff, as the entire rest of the world combined. So I'm not quite sure what's going on there. 5G really is an Asian thing at this point, although T-Mobile is getting us into the game by covering.
No, I mean, I would say if T-Mobile is covering 150 million people with mid-band right now, that's larger than the population of Korea.
Absolutely. So in Korea, you look at the percentage, and they're 90%, not 45%. Although they may be fudging that a little. But somebody just went around Seoul, which is a quarter of Korea, and got 94% 5G coverage. China at this point is at 170. It's somewhere around. The coverage is about coverage is 700 to 900 million people. The number of subscribers right now is in the high 200s, and by the end of, in another couple of months, it will be more than the US total population of 326 million or so. So yes, T-Mobile's getting us in the game, and Verizon and AT&T will have to match it. So we're going to have a fairly decent network that covers 90% of the US with something in the hundreds of megabits over the next 3 years. But Sascha's has people out getting the data on what's going on right now, and I find that very interesting, and that's why I wanted to. Now, how do people find out about Sascha's latest ideas other than on PCMag.com?
So I am on Twitter pretty much constantly. as Sascha Segan on Twitter. And I have a weekly newsletter that goes out called Sascha Segan's Race to 5G. And if you just Google PC Mag newsletters, you'll get the sign up. You'll get the sign up screen for that. But yeah, Twitter and the newsletter are other ways to get at me, other than just looking at what I'm doing on PC Mag. But yeah, I'm giving updates on the 5G networks on pretty much a weekly basis right now. Though, as I said, what I'm most excited for is the big drive test we're doing. And then we go and do Canada in the fall. We drive around the US and then we publish that, then we drive around Canada.
Canada is going to be much lower at this point because they don't have the mid-band spectrum yet.
Except that the Canadian carriers have so much bandwidth for 4G that pretty frequently, at least last year, we were finding that the Canadian 4G networks were faster than what the US was claiming to be 5G. The Canadian 4G networks, especially Bell and Telus, are often using up to 95 megahertz for 4G, it's just more airwaves than any of our carriers had available.
And what was the speed you were finding on 4G on a good day in Canada?
So in Canada, I remember we were seeing peaks on 4G we definitely saw some numbers over 700. And we pretty frequently saw...
Slow down a second, because that's something that's interesting.
Yeah.
We're talking 5G is 300, 400 on a good
averages.
Day. Yeah. So 300 to 500, and very occasionally more than that. What did you find in Canada 4G?
It could peak at 700.
And what did you find typically?
I'd have to go back into my story, but we pretty frequently saw numbers in the 2s.
Okay, which is better than 5G in most of the world. In
Yes.
other words, 5G, well, let's hear Sascha's opinion on 5G versus 4G.
The secret is it's really just about how much bandwidth are you using. That's the thing. And in most of the world up until now, the 5G networks have not been given access to more airwaves than you can use for 4G. So they aren't necessarily any better. The way 4G works is that with 4G, you can have lanes or channels of up to 20 megahertz each. And on the most recent equipment, you can bind up to 7 of those. So you have a 7-lane highway, which is 140 megahertz wide, with your data rushing across it. The widest I've ever tested is 95 megahertz. That's still pretty wide. With 5G, you can have up to 800 megahertz in current configurations. But first of all, that's only available on millimeter wave, which has the range of about as far as you can throw a baseball. And most of the networks out there are using 100 megahertz or less. So you have this situation where there just isn't enough spectrum being used for 5G for it to give a very different experience than 4G. The 5G spec allows more airwaves to be used, but the governments have not assigned these large quantities of airwaves that 5G would want to the 5G carriers. And that's because other people are using them. There's a limited amount of spectrum out there. And the greatest challenge in pushing wireless forward right now, in my view, is how do we make enough spectrum available to enable new features? And then how do we get it built out properly? That's the step 1 and the step 2.
We'll get to that after the break that we have to take in a moment. Stu, how long do we have before the break to fill?
Another 2-3 minutes. Carry on.
Yeah, Sasha's focused on the U.S. and he has the best data on the U.S. The international stuff is pretty dynamic. Actually, China is using 200 megahertz for its network, which is jointly
but that is the sum of 3 carriers. It's chopped up. That's the thing.
But it has the two. No, what are you saying? 3 carriers.
Each of their operators only has 80.
No, that's not what's. This is my stuff.
Okay.
The China Telecom and China Unicom each have 100 megahertz of mid-band spectrum.
Okay.
They are building one network, just like Telus and Bell Canada are doing. And they're using 200 megahertz, which is not in the 5G specification for the bands that they are using. You have to go up to millimeter wave to get the 400 and 800 that you're talking about.
No, Qualcomm's most recent stuff can do 200 on sub-6. Yeah.
It can, because they needed it for China. But as far as I know, it wasn't in the 5G spec. They may have changed that.
It wasn't in release 15. It's in release 16.
Okay. You're closer to that than me. So the 200 is there, and most of Europe now has the mid-band. So everybody from Telefonica in Spain to British Telecom to Deutsche Telekom has 80 to 100 megahertz, even though they haven't built out those networks very far. But they have released that spectrum across most of Europe, obviously in Korea, Japan, South Asia, Malaysia, and Thailand. In Malaysia, they decided that it's ridiculous to build 2 networks or 3 networks or 4 networks. So the government is going to build a 5G network, and all the carriers are going to share it, which Rwanda did in 4G, all of which were boring people with. But I just threw it in here because we had said something slightly different before. I'm going to press Sascha after the break to say, okay, how does your life change if you have 200 megabits, 300 megabits, or 2 gigabits for that matter? But I think I should be handing over to Stu for a break now.
Yeah, okay. That's something I really want to hear about too, Dave, with all this hype about speed and capability of the network. What does it actually mean? Anyway.
Oh, do you have Public Enemy queued up to play the right song?
Oh, no, I didn't. I'm sorry. I've got Giant Steps, John Coltrane.
Which is far finer than Public Enemy's Don't Believe the Hype.
Okay. So this is Community and Technology on WHCR 90.3, The Voice of Harlem. We'll be right back after a brief musical break. Stay tuned. we're back. That was a little John Coltrane's Giant Steps. And this is Community and Technology. And we're here with Dave Burstein, Stu Reid, and very special guest, Sascha Segan. And just before the break, we were talking about 5G and hype versus reality. And Dave asked a question, well, once this 5G does what we think it, or what they say it's going to do, what impact will that have on actual usage, which is a question of great interest to me. Did I state the question right, Dave?
And we've got to unmute Sascha's mic. Sascha, something.
You got to mute yourself there, Sascha, to come back with us.
Sascha is unfortunately.
I don't think I muted myself.
No, I muted you during the musical break.
Okay.
But I can't unmute you, unfortunately.
Okay.
Yeah. So go ahead. Sascha is a PC Mag analyst extraordinaire, and we've been talking with him about 5G and wireless technology. And Dave, you had a question before the break that you wanted to pose.
Well, Sascha and I have been talking about what the performance is. We found that some of the 5G in the US is getting 300-400 megabits down. Typically, the good stuff is 20 to 40 megabits up. Most of the thing that's called 5G, and I don't think it ever should have been called 5G, but that's just semantics, is at 4G speeds, which now are typically 50 to 150 megabits down. Sascha, but now let's talk about, does it really matter? What does matter? Obviously, huge downloads, you can use the speed, but how fast is your connection now?
My connection at home or my mobile connection?
Both.
I mean, for my connection at home, I have fiber, which is the gold standard. And so I have a 500 megabit symmetrical fiber connection, which honestly everybody should have into their home. And that should be the way we do home internet in America, but it's not going to be for various reasons. And as we were saying earlier on the show, if there's one thing that 5G offers potentially to a lot of people in the short term, it's the capacity to offer decent wireless home internet to a lot of people who are currently stuck with DSL. So that would be the number one initial use for this greater. It's not really the speed, because as we were discussing earlier, you can get amazing peak speeds on various 4G technologies. A lot of it is just the capacity that's been added to the network, meaning that people don't have data caps anymore, and people can use as much data as they want on the network, which makes it viable for home internet, which makes you able to offer internet to your average American home, which now uses, several hundred gigabytes a month of data. And so if you're talking about a short-term 5G usage, the capacity to improve our home internet situation, that would be your short-term application. But it's also a little boring.
3 or 4% of the US who can only get DSL but could get decent wireless either now or in the next few months. Because 90% of the US, like me, can get a nice cable connection. But let's keep going. What can you do today? What can you do today on 5G beside what you say, better than DSL home internet, that you want to do, that anybody cares about, that you can't do on 4G?
So the major other use for it today is ironically something which we have not been taking advantage of for the past year, which is that 5G does not have congestion in large crowds in the way 4G did. And so when you, in theory, And now we have to look back to people planning 5G networks before COVID. One of the if you vaguely remember getting together with large groups of people, say in a concert hall or a sports stadium or an outdoor concert or on a campus or at a festival, in a parade, any of these things which we haven't done for a year and a half, those would pretty frequently overwhelm the 4G networks, and you would have a lot of dropped and blocked connections. The carriers would bring in cells on wheels. They would chop up the cells to offer more potential connections to more people. There would be various ways to solve that. 5G has solutions for that, so that in those contexts, people have more reliable connections. So that is one use for 5G.
Stu, can you think of anything that you can't do on your mobile phone that you would be able to do if you had 300 megabits down and 25 megabits up?
No, I can't think of anything on my phone per se, but if I were using the phone as my home connection, that might change the calculus somewhat.
Let's go to connections. What can you think of that you can't do on a 100 megabit down, 20 megabit up cable modem that you could do on a 300 megabit or 400 megabit down mobile connection?
Nothing. I mean, 3 or 4 of us at home might be Zooming simultaneously under some circumstances. Yeah, but I think that's not an issue with you got 100 megabits down and 20 up.
Zoom only needs a megabit.
So the other issue, the issue is not average. So the real issue is not averages, it's floors. Okay, and it's that.
What's that mean, Sasha? Break it down.
It is the issue that a lot of people run into, which frustrates a lot of people, which prevents a lot of applications, has nothing to do with the average speed. It has to do with the minimum speed that can be relied on, and the minimum speed that you have either at peak times or in congested circumstances. And a lot of people out there who have cable connections may be paying for 100 megabits, but at peak times, they are experiencing far, far less than that. And I get a lot of complaints from these people.
I know you get a lot of complaints because the 1% who may have a problem may be complaining. And it's 9 times out of 10, it's their home Wi-Fi, not their cable connection that the problem is. But what is the data that you have when you test it? Because most of the data I've seen is cable connections, mine certainly, but I've seen lots of data doesn't suggest that you often on a 100 meg connection go below 75 or even below 90. Do you what's your data show?
Well, we have a piece called Fastest ISPs that we do based on a large user survey of speed tests each year, and I would turn to that. I haven't memorized the results on that one, but I would look at PCMag Fastest ISPs, and we do get a lot of results through that of people having apparently slow results in congested circumstances. Network congestion is a thing.
Upstream or downstream?
Downstream. I mean, if you want to talk about upstream, the bigger problem.
Some trouble.
Yeah,
on cable.
Upstream is a disaster on cable.
No, you don't see significant slowdowns of more than 10%.
Oh, actually, mostly what I was mentioning vis-a-vis the disaster is that the cable companies generally offer extremely slow upstream packages with extremely asymmetrical connections. I believe there was a news story this week about one of the major cable companies heavily cutting their upstream speeds.
Yeah, right here in Long Island. In fact, that would be your cable company, Cablevision. I think it's the most of Queens. They have decided that there's so little competition that they had been giving you 25 meg up, and that if for the same price you now will only get 10 meg up. And that was what's his name at The Verge who broke that story, and his headline was prices up 86% at Altice, the old Cablevision, and that shows you why we're not doing a good job on pricing.
But was that a engineering issue with congestion that?
No, they did it because they could do it.
And can make more money doing it that way.
Yeah, there's no engineering. There turns out to be a minor problem in cable upstream right now. That, as I say, fewer than 10% are not who are sold 10 megabits are sometimes seeing 7 or 6. I happen to be on the advisory board of ASSIA that have optimization software which is used around the world in over 100 million lines. So I actually see the data around the world. Congestion is not pulling down much at all on cable, except for that upstream. And it is, oddly enough, although I don't have this from ASSIA because they don't have any customers there, a big issue in China because they didn't have enough backhaul. So they get fiber to the home to everybody in China. They could give a gigabit, and average speeds were sitting there at a couple of dozen megabits in many places. They're mostly fixing that. Let's go on to some other stuff that you know about. Sascha, you said you were interested in community networks. How many successful ones have you seen?
Well, I mean, it comes down to what do you define as a community network? If you look at, like, I have a relatively expansive view where it includes really any publicly owned or nonprofit co-op network.
Let's hold that separate because there's a big difference there. There's a lot of interesting munis, but the reason it's coming up is that Stu is actually out there building a real community network. It has been for 25 years. The Internet Society has been pushing it hard for 10 years, and it's in all the proposals from Washington. And the answer to the question, how many have succeeded, if you exclude municipals, and that includes municipal co-ops, almost none have built a sustainable, successful community network. Stu, it hasn't been easy for you. What makes a community network work?
Well,
it's actually in the community.
I'll say you got to start on the ground. The first thing you need is community buy-in, and the work that we're doing is we actually partner with the end users. We partner with the residents themselves, mostly in public and affordable housing, and they become cooperative owners on a nonprofit basis of the facilities that we're putting in. So they are actually part of the solution. I think when you approach the problem that way, it kind of turns things on its head, and you're not asking people to buy something. You're not asking folks to make a commercial decision. You're asking folks to become part of a community undertaking that is bringing resources and solutions to their community.
It's funny, Stu. So I'm in a labor union, and at a lot of the union meetings, there's been a lot of talk of moving from a service model of the union to a mass organizing model of the union. Moving from a model where, although it's a community group, the average person sees it as an organization providing a service, to something where every individual sees themselves as part of the effort. And it sounds like you're doing the same thing for the network.
Yes, exactly. That's the whole philosophy. And if you're able to adopt that philosophy and you're able to buy in from the folks in the community, I think you got a chance to survive. And all our efforts small and not really widespread. We've done stuff in the South Bronx, done stuff in Harlem, have some ongoing things in Harlem right now, and looking to expand it. What we're seeing is that as folks start to really use it and understand it, and one of the other things I would say, Sasha, and Dave knows this, is that as you build in applications and services on top of the network, you're giving people a reason to use it that resonates with them. That starts to change things. You're not just selling a connection. You're not just selling an internet commodity. You're selling a whole suite of services that comes with it that speaks to their needs. When you're able to do that, I think you change the calculus.
Well, here in New York, Stu, did you have a lot of uptake around this year of remote schooling? Because I feel like that is an application which caused so many of us in the city to say, well, we need a reliable network.
Yeah, absolutely. You had a lot of folks who parents who didn't know why they needed internet at home, and especially for low income folks where economic resources are scarce. To make it a decision to deploy money for that, you got to have a compelling reason. And I think certainly the pandemic and remote learning from home was one of those. But you still have a lot of folks that, compelling reason or not, don't have the resources to pay that $60 or more per month. So again, our model, and we are structuring our stuff so that we have buy-in, but the service is actually provided free to the end user. And they donate to the co-op, they're part owners of the co-op, but they're not actually buying the service. And we're taking baby steps, but folks are embracing it, and it's working. We're looking to expand it. We're going after resources right now because of just the heightened awareness that you spoke of, Sasha, and the need. And now you have the government that's throwing around a lot of money. So we're looking for ways to expand and to really kind of build out this whole effort. But we think that model, community ownership, community buy-in, community applications, is the way to go. Because you're not, a community network is not going to compete with a Verizon, with an AT&T, with the Comcast. It's ludicrous to think that you can. So you really have to approach the problem in a whole nother way.
There's a lot of people in Washington who assume that a community network, even one that doesn't have any experience building networks, can compete with Verizon and Comcast. And that's why I'm asking this question.
Mm-hmm.
But Sascha, you mentioned municipal networks within the context of community networks. Do you know much about the network in Chattanooga?
I know something about the network in Chattanooga.
Tell our listeners.
So more than 10 years ago at this point, Chattanooga decided to enable its municipally owned power company, EPB, to build gigabit fiber to the home. For their goal was to every home in Chattanooga. I don't believe they quite made that, but they got to the vast majority of Chattanooga as an attempt to as a economic growth engine, and they called that Chattanooga Gig City. And EPB has built out fiber to the home to most of Chattanooga. They are offering it at, I believe, $60 a month, that oligopoly price, but they are offering a uniformly high quality connection across the city at that oligopoly price. So that did result in a lot of growth of usage of the internet in Chattanooga, and it resulted in the other commercial providers stepping up their game as well. And I believe AT&T has tried to build some competing fiber in Chattanooga, has not built that much of it, but they are trying to compete. And it has definitely been a boon to the city. But of course, what you do see in Chattanooga, and you see in another city with a quasi-muni nonprofit co-op fiber network I can think of is Bemidji, Minnesota, where I just love it because it's called the Paul Bunyan Cooperative, because that's where Paul Bunyan is from. And what you see in these cities, though, is you do see they do a great job of building out, and they do it at that oligopoly price that is competitive with the cable companies, but nobody's really bringing the price down hard. That is the muni or co-op or private. No one is competing on price, really.
Yeah. Yeah, you know, at the end of the day, I don't see how little guy is going to do that with these monopoly, duopoly providers. I mean, you can't beat them on.
Wait a minute. Wait a minute.
Undercut you.
There are at least a dozen, in fact, there are at least 50 major policy people in Washington who think that if somebody builds fiber with government money, that will bring affordable broadband to America. One of them is named Joe Biden, who just said as much in 3 different official announcements, one of which was an email coming to me under his name, that he was going to bring affordable broadband to everyone in America. And when I look at the proposal, he's assuming that putting in a fiber provider is going to do that. Stu, what does Scott Walston say about that? The economist broadband plan.
Quite simply doesn't work. He's a noted economist, and he has hard data that shows that the prices do not come down. To Sascha's point about the oligopoly, that's exactly what happens. And we live right here in New York, where they're a cable provider and a phone provider, and we've seen it in operation. It does not work.
Yeah, I actually have at my home, I have 3 decent, high quality, high speed home internet choices. I have Spectrum, I have Fios, and now I have T-Mobile.
Mm-hmm.
And they are oddly not competing on price.
And as it happens, Stu and I are, as the policy committee of the Internet Society of New York, are going to try to get this through the thick heads of friends of ours who are very dedicated, very honorable, very smart people in Washington who have a confirmation bias problem that they can't believe that the data says the second provider is not going to bring down prices. How are we doing on time, Stu?
We are out of time, Dave. We're out of time. And this subject is such an important one, and a detailed and nuanced one. We got to come back to it.
Well, Stu, we're going to come back to it publicly. Let me say, Sascha, anytime you feel like talking on the radio, you'll be more than welcome.
Thanks a lot.
You're out there finding what's going on in the world, and you are presented very well. PCMagazine.com. It's PCMag.com now.
PCMag.com. We got rid of the azine when we stopped printing paper.
Okay. And he also has a weekly newsletter that's about 5G, but also tells you the truth about what 5G isn't and isn't doing. Don't believe the hype.
Okay. Thank you, Dave. Thank you, Sascha Segan from PC Magazine. This has been Community and Technology on WHCR 90.3 FM. Tune in next week, 5 o'clock, for more tech news. Thanks for tuning in. Good night, guys.